The rain fell relentlessly, droplets hitting the window pane before merging into streaks, mirroring Isla Montgomery's heavy heart. She sat curled up on the window seat of her upscale Manhattan apartment, eyes fixed on the flickering city lights. Not because she loved the rain, but because she didn't want to face reality. At 26, Isla Montgomery was a highly regarded corporate strategist in New York's elite financial circles. To outsiders, she was strong, intelligent, and composed, a woman who never let anything break her. But the truth? Her life had been shaped by loss, betrayal, and loneliness. And tomorrow, her life would no longer be her own, because tomorrow she would marry a man she never loved. Ela Montgomery was born into one of New York's most prestigious families. Her father, Richard Montgomery, was a powerful figure in the financial world. She had grown up surrounded by wealth, but money had never equaled happiness. Her mother, Ela Montgomery, was the kindest woman Isla had ever known. She could still recall the warmth of her mother's embrace, the bedtime stories whispered in the dark. But it all ended when her mother passed away from a terminal illness when Isla was just 10 years old. From that moment, her world turned cold. 3 years later, her father remarried Catherine Montgomery, an ambitious and calculating woman. The first time Isla met her, she knew Catherine would never love her. Catherine never raised her voice, never lashed out physically, but her words were sharper than any blade. "Isla, you shouldn't spend so much time at home. A Montgomery heiress should have friends of her own status. That dress is far too cheap for a Montgomery. But then again, does it even matter? No one notices you anyway." She had once tried to regain her father's love, but it was futile. He never shielded her from Catherine. His work had always been his top priority, and Isla had always been just a shadow in his life. And so she learned the hard way, the only person she could rely on was herself. But no matter how strong she pretended to be, she couldn't deny the truth. Her house had never been a home. Lately, Montgomery Enterprises was standing on the edge of collapse. Massive debts, shareholders losing confidence, failed business deals. It was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. Isla didn't care about the company, but she couldn't ignore the growing tension between her father and Catherine. Then, on a stormy night, she was summoned to the living room. The moment she stepped down the stairs, she felt it. Something was wrong. Catherine sat elegantly on the sofa, a glass of wine in her hand, her sharp eyes gleaming with calculation. Across from her, Richard Montgomery looked more exhausted than ever. Catherine spoke first, her voice light but heavy with unspoken pressure. "Montgomery Enterprises is in danger. We need a solution." Isla crossed her arms, raising a brow. "And what does that have to do with me?" Catherine smirked, placing a stack of documents on the table. "You will marry Nicholas Blackwell." The air in the room froze. Isla felt her blood turn to ice. Nicholas Blackwell, the CEO of Blackwell Industries, one of the most powerful conglomerates in the city. He wasn't just wealthy, he was infamous for his cold, ruthless nature. Isla shot up from her seat, her voice scorching the air. "No way, I am not your puppet." Catherine took a slow sip of wine before speaking, utterly unbothered. "Do you think you have a choice? Without Nicholas, the company will crumble. Your father will lose everything." Isla turned sharply to her father, her voice shaking with anger and heartbreak. "Are you really going to let them use me like a bargaining chip?" But Richard Montgomery said nothing. No words of comfort, no words of protest. Just silence. A sharp blade of betrayal pierced straight through Isla's heart. The man she had once admired had sold her like a piece on a chessboard. Catherine tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. "You can hate me all you want, Isla, but the wedding will happen." Isla clenched her fists, her breath unsteady. She looked at her father, waiting, hoping he would say something, anything. But he remained silent. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest. So this was it. The man who was supposed to protect her had just sold her off like a mere business deal. She let out a shaky breath, blinking back the sting in her eyes. And then, slowly, she smirked, a cold, defiant smile. "Fine, I'll marry him, but don't expect me to be obedient." 3 days later, Isla was summoned to one of the most luxurious hotels in New York. When the elevator doors slid open to the top floor, she felt it instantly, the suffocating coldness of the air around her. Stepping into the VIP suite, her gaze landed on the man she was being forced to marry, Nicholas Blackwell. He sat on a sleek black leather sofa, exuding power and detachment. His features were chiseled to perfection: sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, a face carved from ice. His tailored suit was flawless, not a wrinkle in sight, just like the man himself, ruthless, pristine, and utterly devoid of warmth. Isla smirked, breaking the silence. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell. I'm Isla Montgomery, also known as your reluctant bride." The air between them grew heavier. Nicholas didn't move, didn't blink. He simply watched her, his gaze sharp, assessing, as if stripping away every layer of her defenses. The way he looked at her made her feel exposed, vulnerable. But she refused to show weakness, so she tilted her head, her smirk deepening. Then, in a low, deep voice, he finally spoke. "I don't care who you are, this is just a business transaction. We marry, live together for a year, then divorce. I have no time for childish games." A heavy weight settled in Isla's chest. She had expected Nicholas to be an emotionless machine, but seeing it firsthand still left a bitter taste in her mouth. Nicholas slid a thick stack of documents toward her. "Read through it. If you agree, sign at the bottom." Isla flipped through the pages, scanning the clauses. No interference in each other's personal lives, no emotional involvement, no public scandals or embarrassment. The contract lasts 5 years, after which divorce is an option. She let out a dry chuckle, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Do you seriously think emotions can be controlled by a contract?" Nicholas remained impassive, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to control them, because I will never love you." Isla clutched her chest in mock pain. "Oh no, my poor heart shattered to pieces." Nicholas didn't react. His face was as unreadable as ever. She shrugged, picking up the pen and signing her name with deliberate nonchalance. "All right, Mr. Blackwell, I'll play your little game." The wedding was a grand illusion, a luxurious ceremony filled with high-profile guests and flashing cameras, but devoid of love, devoid of warmth. Isla wore a pristine white gown, but inside she felt nothing but ice. When the priest asked, "Nicholas Blackwell, do you take Ela Montgomery as your wife?" Nicholas didn't hesitate. His voice was deep, cold, and utterly emotionless. "I do." Isla raised an eyebrow at him, a smirk playing on her lips. She shrugged and spoke, her tone dripping with amusement. "Well then, I suppose I do too." Nicholas shot her a sharp glance but said nothing. The door to Nicholas's penthouse slammed shut, sealing them away from the outside world. Isla stepped forward, her eyes scanning the space. No roses, no champagne, no romance. Only sleek, modern perfection, cold, lifeless, just like its owner. She crossed her arms, smirking. "Well, Mr. Blackwell, this is our wedding night. Don't you think you should at least pretend to treat your wife properly?" Nicholas loosened his tie with precise movements, his voice razor sharp. "What exactly are you expecting?" Isla blinked innocently. "Oh, nothing extravagant. Maybe some wine, a pleasant conversation, or just a little affection." Nicholas let out a dry chuckle. Humorless, devoid of warmth. "You're wasting both of our time." He set his whiskey glass down, stepping closer. His presence was imposing, suffocating, yet still unreadable. "We both know this isn't a real marriage. There's no need to pretend." Isla tilted her head, laughing softly. "Are you always like this, cold, rigid, completely devoid of any fun?" Nicholas remained silent. He merely removed his watch, placing it neatly on the table. Mechanical, controlled, detached. His indifference irritated her more than anything. She crossed her arms, eyes glinting mischievously. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, do you even know what a wedding night is supposed to be?" Nicholas slid his hands into his pockets, his gaze unwavering. "I don't care." Isla smirked, twirling his tie around her fingers. She took a slow step closer, watching him carefully. "Then I suppose I'll have to make you care." Nicholas exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. He reached for his tie, yanking it from her grasp. "Stop testing me." His voice was lower now, edged with warning. Isla only laughed softly, stepping back with a victorious glint in her eyes. Nicholas Blackwell wasn't as unaffected as he pretended to be. Without warning, she grabbed his abandoned tie, twisting it around her fingers before giving it a playful tug. Nicholas stilled. His stormy gray eyes darkened. Just slightly. Isla's voice dropped to a whisper, teasing but firm. "Have you read the contract, Nicholas?" His jaw tensed, but he didn't move away. Every word. Isla let the tie slip from her fingers, stepping back with a daring smile. "Good, then you should remember the first clause." Nicholas held her gaze for a long moment before finally turning away. "Don't test me, Isla." The door to the guest bedroom clicked shut behind him. Isla grinned. Nicholas Blackwell had noticed her. And this was just the beginning. 3 weeks after the wedding, Isla's real nightmare began. She was in her office, flipping through a stack of documents, when her phone vibrated, an unknown number. She answered, her voice steady as always. "Hello." But the voice on the other end wasn't her father's. It wasn't Catherine's either. It was a stranger's voice, cold, detached, tinged with regret. "Is this Ela Montgomery?" She frowned. "Yes, speaking. We regret to inform you that your father, Mr. Richard Montgomery, passed away this morning due to a sudden heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital, but he didn't make it." The world around Isla shattered in an instant. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. "No, that's not possible." Her voice barely escaped her lips. "I'm very sorry for your loss." The phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the desk with a soft thud. At that moment, her world collapsed. Richard Montgomery had never truly been a father to her. He had never fought for her, never protected her, but he had still been her only family. And now he was gone. 3 days later, at the funeral, Isla stood motionless by the grave, dressed in black, her face unreadable. The drizzle fell, seeping into her skin, but she felt nothing. Beside her, Nicholas stood silently, his stormy gray eyes watching as Richard Montgomery was lowered into the ground. But for the first time, he realized Isla was different. The woman who was always full of sarcasm, always taunting him, now looked empty, distant, as if she had lost everything. No smirks, no playful defiance, just silence. And for some reason, that unsettled Nicholas. A short distance away, Catherine Montgomery played her role perfectly, the grieving widow, her expression sculpted with just the right amount of sorrow. But Isla knew better. Catherine wasn't mourning, she was waiting. Because when the funeral ended, she finally made her move. "Richard is gone, Isla." Catherine's voice was terrifyingly calm. "And as of today, Montgomery Enterprises belongs to me." Isla's fists clenched, but her voice remained cold as ice. "You're lying." Catherine chuckled, pulling a stack of documents from her bag and placing them on the table with smug satisfaction. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Isla flipped through the pages. And then, she saw it. Her father's signature at the bottom of the contract. A legal document transferring full ownership of Montgomery Enterprises to Catherine Montgomery. Rage burned in her chest. Ela lifted her gaze, her voice sharp as a blade. "You forced him to sign this, or you forged it." Catherine shrugged, her tone almost amused. "Believe what you want. It doesn't change the fact that I've won." Ila's teeth clenched. She had lost her father, and now Catherine had stolen his entire legacy. But the worst part wasn't over yet. Catherine leisurely pulled out another set of documents and slid them across the table. "If you behave, I might let you keep a small share." Symbolic, of course. Isla slapped the papers away, her eyes blazing. "You think I'd accept this?" Catherine smirked, her gaze dripping with amusement. "Then what will you do? You're powerless, Ela. You have no allies. Who will help you? Nicholas?" Iceland's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" Catherine pushed another contract toward her. her movements deliberate. "Nicholas and I have already struck a deal. If he collaborates with me, Blackwell Industries will receive a large stake in Montgomery Enterprises." Isla stared at the words. No, this couldn't be real. Nicholas had betrayed her? That night, at Nicholas's penthouse, Isla stormed into the room, her eyes burning with fury. "You did this, didn't you?" She threw the documents onto the table, her voice shaking with bitterness. "You made a deal with Catherine. You betrayed me." Nicholas glanced at the papers, then up at her. But what broke her the most was that he didn't deny it immediately. The silence cut deeper than any blade. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "I was a fool to think you were different." Nicholas's face remained unreadable, but his eyes held something deeper. "Is that what you think?" Isla gritted her teeth. "Then explain yourself." Nicholas exhaled, pushing the documents aside. "I was never on Catherine's side. I only pretended to work with her to bring her down." Isla froze. "What?" Nicholas stood, stepping toward her. His gaze was no longer cold, but resolute. "I'm going to help you take back the company." Isla searched his eyes for deception, but for the first time, she saw sincerity. She took a slow breath, then nodded. "All right, let's take Catherine down together. In war, the most important thing is a powerful ally, and Isla had no choice but to put her trust in Nicholas Blackwell." That night, they sat across from each other in Nicholas's penthouse office. Isla folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "So what's your plan?" Nicholas flipped open a file, sliding it toward her. Isla glanced down. Inside were stacks of documents related to Montgomery Enterprises. "We have 3 steps," Nicholas said, his voice firm. 1. Find a loophole in Catherine's inheritance contract. 2. Weaken her position with the shareholders. 3. Take back control during the next board meeting. Isla frowned, flipping through the pages. "And do you actually have any proof?" Nicholas smirked slightly, pulling out another set of documents. "I have the best legal team in New York. They reviewed Catherine's contract and found signs of fraud." Isla's head snapped up, her heart pounding. "Are you saying we actually have a chance?" Nicholas nodded, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Yes. If we expose this to the board, Catherine will lose everything." For the first time in weeks, hope flickered inside Isla, but Nicholas wasn't finished. "However, evidence alone won't be enough. We need to weaken her first." Isla clenched her fists. "I can convince some of the board members to turn against her." Nicholas leaned back, nodding. "Then that's where we start. You handle the people, I'll handle the legal side. By the time the board meeting arrives, Catherine Montgomery will no longer be queen." Isla studied him for a long moment. This was no longer just a business arrangement. For the first time, she felt like someone was truly on her side. She took a deep breath and reached out her hand. "Let's end this." Nicholas grasped her hand firmly, giving it a light squeeze. Time to take Catherine down. The plan was set. Isla and Nicholas immediately put it into motion. Nicholas brought in the best legal team in New York to analyze the inheritance contract. Just as he suspected, there were signs of forgery in Richard Montgomery's signature. "We need to present this to the board," Nicholas said, his eyes cold with determination. "Once the contract is questioned, Catherine's power will collapse." Isla nodded. "I'll take care of the shareholders." Isla met privately with the board members loyal to her father, revealing Catherine's true motives. "He doesn't care about the company. She's using it for her own benefit," Isla told a group of key shareholders. Doubt began to creep into their minds. Meanwhile, Nicholas dug up evidence of Catherine's shady financial deals, further eroding her credibility. The day of the board meeting arrived. Catherine entered the conference room radiating confidence, but Isla and Nicholas were ready to take her down. Isla rose to her feet, placing a folder on the table. "Today, I'm here to expose the truth about Catherine Montgomery." She flipped through the documents, presenting proof of the forged contract, Catherine's suspicious transactions, and the company's financial decline under her management. The shareholders began whispering among themselves, their faith in Catherine wavering. Nicholas stood, his voice cutting through the tension. I motion for a vote to remove Catherine Montgomery from her position as head of Montgomery Enterprises. The room fell silent. Catherine's face paled, but she couldn't stop what was coming. Finally, the board voted. Catherine was officially removed from power. Isla turned to Nicholas, and for the first time, she felt victorious. Catherine was furious, but it was over. Montgomery Enterprises was back in Isla's hands. At last, the war was over. Montgomery Enterprises was back in Isla's hands. Catherine was utterly defeated, leaving the building in disgrace. But Isla didn't feel the triumph she had expected. She stood on the penthouse balcony, gazing at the glittering cityscape, yet inside, she felt empty. She had reclaimed her company. She had won. But now what? Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Nicholas. He stood there, his eyes no longer distant. "We won," he said softly. Isla let out a quiet laugh, devoid of joy. "And what about our marriage?" Nicholas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a familiar stack of papers. Their marriage contract. Isla held her breath as he pulled out a lighter. In mere seconds, flames engulfed the pages, the fire consuming every clause, every condition. Isla's breath caught in her throat as Nicholas flicked the lighter open. The flame danced dangerously close to the pages. "Wait," she started, but it was too late. The fire caught, devouring the contract in seconds. She watched in stunned silence as the paper curled into blackened ashes, the last remnants of their transaction turning to dust. Her heart pounded. This wasn't Nicholas Blackwell, the ruthless businessman. This was something else, something terrifyingly real. Nicholas met her gaze, his voice low but certain. "I don't want a marriage with conditions anymore. I want you." Isla couldn't tear her eyes away from the ashes of their marriage contract. The clauses, the conditions, the rules they had set, all reduced to nothing. She looked up, meeting Nicholas's gaze. "Are you really willing to throw everything away?" Nicholas stepped closer, slow but deliberate. "This marriage started as a transaction, but it isn't anymore." Isla's heart pounded. She had always believed Nicholas was cold, incapable of emotion, but now there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something real. She shook her head, still unsure. "You're not someone who believes in love." Nicholas let out a soft chuckle, but this time, it wasn't mocking. "Maybe you're right, but if I have to believe in something, I want to believe in you." For the first time, Isla no longer saw Nicholas Blackwell as an emotionless machine. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke louder than words. Nicholas reached for her hand, pulling her gently closer. "Give me a chance to start over." Isla held his gaze. This time, no walls, no doubt. She nodded slowly. "All right, but Nicholas, this time, you don't get to run away." Nicholas smiled, then leaned in, pressing a soft but certain kiss against her lips. This was no longer a contract marriage. This was a new beginning.